It's a joy to see everyone. So I want to welcome those who are here as visitors for this very special immersion, intensive, and it's a great honor in many ways to have you here, and a joy because it may be the last time we can invite people. We don't know. We're going to keep inviting, but they may not be able to come. Conditions are changing rapidly. So, I've been cocooning for a couple of days trying to figure out how much about the current situation should be spoken of and how relevant that is to the visitors. Because from a perspective of traditional Sat Yoga, which is a perspective on reality that is non-dual, it's part of the Advaita yoga tradition that goes back to the earliest moments in the historical development of yoga. The world conditions are irrelevant, since the world is only a non-existent dream. And we are the dreamers of that dream, but we don't exist as a multiplicity, but as a unified field. And it's the illusion of the multiplicity, the illusion that each one is a separate consciousness identified with the bodily organism that creates the suffering and the sense of separation from that wholeness that produces the need for a process like yoga. Yoga itself, of course, I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here, and everyone who is here knows a lot about yoga already, but the word means union. And there's a question, is it an act of union that has to be achieved? Does one have to move from a state of duality into non-duality? Or is it simply a union that has to be realized, recognized consciously in order to overcome the emotional limitations, let's say, and instabilities of the ego level of consciousness identified with the body and with the sense of separation from the uncreated infinite self that in reality we are. In Sat Yoga, which is an attempt to recapitulate that original yoga, we will speak about it in both ways, but the primary way is the most direct, which is the realization that you are already that. There's nothing that needs to be done. And by affirming or ratifying that there is something that needs to be done, then you're ratifying the reality of the doer that needs to get better, get more holy, get more unified, get more silent, change in some way. Whereas it's not really necessary. What's necessary is simply a shift of paradigm in which the non-dual truth is realized regardless of the state of the ego or the state of the organism or the state of the world. All of that is irrelevant. So I want to emphasize that that is the truth. And yet, through experience, I've discovered that that's a very simple yet very difficult truth for those who are at the ego level of the illusion to grok and to make use of, to achieve the liberation that they already have, but cannot feel the benefits of. So, therefore, we approach this from both non-duality and duality in order to try to help facilitate the overcoming of the obstacles that the ego, in its attachment to the body and the body's personality then that develops attachments to other people and addictions, sense of neediness, a belief that one requires a certain amount of sensual gratification to feel balanced, and a certain amount of props of various kinds in one's environment to feel secure, and the ego wants a certain amount of territory and power and a sense of autonomy and et cetera, that have become part of the world system as it has devolved from those earlier days, earlier yugas, into what we refer to as Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, the Dark Age, the age in which the truth of our non-dual reality has been forgotten, and in which we have fallen to a level of consciousness that is objectively difficult to get out of because of the subjective sense of unworthiness, unbelief, and of attachment and capture by various modes of thinking that are illusory but very tenacious in usurping the consciousness and keeping one enslaved to the momentum of the ego intentionality, even though one wants to witness it and be separate from it and change its direction. The impulses of the ego, its drives, its sense of need for certain kinds of objects can have such a hold, such a magnetic hold and a hypnotic hold on the mind that various approaches to undermine the ego's power over the consciousness have been developed and have needed to be supplemented through time by ever more concrete and symbolic and conceptual understandings within the frame of reference of duality in order to help pry the consciousness loose from the ego's grip. And I'm sure everyone who is here already has experienced those egoic resistances that I hope that this retreat will enable people to overcome, or at least make strides in that direction that will enable liberation to occur easily when it is meant to happen. So that's the word from Lake Woebegone, where there is no woe and everyone's already liberated. But now let's speak in the language of those who are still in a world that is going through some very radical changes that some people may be disturbed by. If that's the case, then I hope that I can offer you some information that will be of help. Maybe not, because maybe you'd rather stay in denial. If so, you're in the wrong place. But hopefully this will be it. Okay, so the first point that I would like to make that probably is not news to anyone is that the planet Earth today is in a state of exception. The French would call it a state of siege, and others would call it martial law or a state of emergency. But the world as people knew it before this pandemic began and the lockdowns and the other withdrawals of our what many people thought were rights and powers and freedom that were inalienable have turned out to be indeed immediately alienable and lost possibly forever. Okay? That's really what the state of exception means. And I'm using that particular phrase especially because there's a great philosopher who is alive today named Giorgio Agamben, who has written about this state. In fact, one of his books is of that title. Agamben. And I want to refer to him and his works, as well as to a number of other, let's call them postmodern philosophers, who have predicted and who have thought very deeply about the situation that we are in and its consequences. So it's not a shock to those who have been studying philosophy and history and political science for a long time. Another name that we should put on the board is that of Michel Foucault, and I guess I should put it on the board. And I would put Deleuze and Guattari. I'll just keep Deleuze on there for now. Foucault is probably the father of what has become known as biopolitics. And he gave a very important series of lectures called The Birth of Biopolitics at the, I think, the École Normale Supérieure in Paris back in the 70s. Or 60s possibly, but Foucault was the I think the father of this whole line of thought in its modern terms. But it goes back to Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi political theorist, and you could go back to Machiavelli. You could go back a long way. That this kind of understanding of power has been present, and it has always been the case. But what Agamben has shown is that humans can be thought of in two forms: Zoe or bios. Both words mean life, but Zoe means bare life. It's any life form. An animal has zoe, and a human being who is categorized as zoe has no more rights than an animal or any other mass of protoplasm. And so, in the categorization of human beings, you can be either zoe or bios. Now, what he meant by bios was not biology, but biography. So if you're in the category of one who has bios, you're a human being who has the right to participate in politics and to vote and to have a voice, and you have certain rights, and you have human dignity. So in the history of societies and politics, there have always been certain categories of humans who have been in the Zoe category, whether they were slaves brought from Africa or Native Americans in relation to the colonists and the European settlers, or they were, in some cases, women or children, but those who were not of the level that were part of the elite were often put into such a category like the untouchables, who had not only no rights, but anything could be done to them. They could be put in concentration camps, etc. The Nazis first moved the Jews into those categories. For the general public, they made them wear the stars and to be separated. There was an apartheid, and then they could be put in camps and treated in the Zoe fashion. So this has always been an option for every society, for every sovereign. And we are now in such a state, but it has been pushed into practice as a medical procedure. Oddly enough, based on the idea of the sacredness of life, we're going to do this in order to protect those who might have the COVID virus, right? But what about all the people who are dying as a result of the lockdown, or who will die as the result of the consequences? Their sacredness is not taken into consideration. So we have again a situation where the excuse is something that is noble, but the underlying reason for it and the results will be the destruction of a society which is already underway. There won't be any return to normal. I think everyone already knows that, right? And there was never intended to be. But the pandemic was never the problem. It was a cover for the fact that the society was already bankrupt and the collapse was going to happen anyway. The capitalist system was bankrupt. And so this enables the bankers not to be blamed, but a virus instead. But everyone understands the absurdity of the particular rules that we are being forced to live under, that become more and more extreme, and that have no relationship really to health, but they do have relationship to becoming Zoe, to becoming one who just shuts up and follows orders, and you have no choice, and don't think you can get away with violating this because they have ways of dealing with you. And pretty soon those who don't give in to mandatory vaccination will be outlaws, etc. So I don't think I'm saying anything that's too radical in terms of what everyone has already seen. How many people have already recognized that this is what is going on? Okay, is this news to anyone who thinks this was just a temporary blip in the situation and everything will go back to some copacetic way of being and all will be well? If so, then I think that there's some naivete. But in addition to all of the, let's say, depressions that are going on, the suicides, because you see, what holds people together is social bonding, and that's what they've claimed is the danger. There has to be social distancing. We have to end social bonds. And that, of course, weakens. That's the whole divide and conquer. But now the whole world has become basically a concentration camp where people are in solitary confinement wherever they're locked down, and have lost the right to travel in many cases, and the right. Look how difficult it was for the ones who traveled here, the tests you had to take, and all of that. These kinds of burdens will be increasing, and the consequences of the breakdown of society in terms of homelessness, impoverishment, famine to come, all of that is on its way, along with many other political, social, physical, geophysical changes that are in our future in a very near term, including wars that will increase. And the situation, of course, will provoke grassroots resistance that will become more and more violent, anarchy because of the illegitimacy of authority that will be perceived, and the loss of any kind of cohesion or an ability to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So that's the situation in a way that is, I think, making the spiritual transformation much more urgent than it might have been under ordinary conditions. Because I think the only solution to the situation we're in, not only to avoid the fear and the anxiety and the depression and all of the other consequences that will happen to those who are still at the ego level, but the change of vibrational frequency. If you understand the truth of quantum physics and the truth of chaos and complexity theory and the truth of non-duality itself, means that as there is a rise in intelligence, in coherence, in vibrational frequency that creates a morphogenetic shift on a planetary level, which can also happen during this same period, and perhaps motivated because of this situation, it can all turn out to be the greatest blessing possible for the evolution of the human spirit. So we're seeing both the darkest possibilities and also the highest possibilities are now becoming emergent properties of the situation. So I haven't said any of the things I've talked about in order to create fear, but to help you extract yourself from any fear that you might have. But the only way to make use of the situation in order to bring it to a very positive conclusion, and in fact a new civilization can be born out of this that's at a much higher level of peace and love and unity, and all of the separations of classes and national boundaries and all of that can be overcome. All of that can be done only if we reach a level individually of resonating with divine love and with detachment from identification with the body, so that we're fearless in regard to death, and that we can move forward with the power of spirit in a united fashion that can overcome the illusions of destruction that will become ever more, let's say, palpable as shifts in the physical plane, but that will be able to bring about a rise of consciousness for those who, not only for those who remain embodied, but for those who become disembodied, to remain part of the field that uplifts the entire planetary noetic field for every being. And it's this function, I think, of those yogis. And by yogis, of course, I mean whether they're Buddhist yogis or Taoist yogis or Hindus or Christian yogis or Jewish yogis or Sufi yogis. It's all one true process of transcending thought, and therefore of transcending the differences in signifiers. I don't care whether you refer to that absolute principle as Allah or Brahman or the Tao or God or any other word. The question is, are you vibrating at that level of absolute frequency in which there is a shift of consciousness from the recognition of objects in a world of multiplicity to that of a world of light, of non-duality. It's that shift in perception, not simply in belief or faith, but in actual perception and unification that is required. So this is basically the preamble to what I think we need to not only understand very deeply, but we need to go to that level of consciousness in which there is silence, in which we have died to the ego while alive, and therefore can overcome the fear of the physical death which is inevitable anyway under all conditions for the human, but to deal with the perhaps horror of planetary death in order to bring about rebirth. And it is that process which has been talked about since the beginning of time by yogis, this process of time being cyclical. We've gone through many Kali Yugas and we always have returned to a new Sat Yuga. It's now time to do that again and to go through a process that is a transformation. And if we understand the truth that quantum physics is bringing now to the consciousness of everyone, the way that they have found, the only way they have found they can unify quantum mechanics with relativity is to recognize that we live in a block universe. They call it a block universe. That's a little too solid for my taste, but what it means is that all of time is here now. Time is actually an illusion. So even though you might think you're going through time, that's only a linear process of the ego's inability to digest all of the information that makes up reality at a single moment. But all of that information is already present. And to the extent that we open up completely to it, we will be able to be in that timeless mode of being that is part of the liberated state of consciousness, even though the bodies will continue to apparently go through time. But everything is already written, it's predetermined, and there's no reason to worry about the future, because the future is actually our ancient past, and we are returning to what we were originally and had simply forgotten. When we can understand that and see that this passage is one that we know very well, and that we can witness it even from a state of consciousness in which we are not doing anything. We are watching the merry-go-round of time from an immovable spot in the center around which the chronos sphere seems to flow, but is all there already, and we can be untouched by the events that are creating the apparent movement in time from one age to another. So I hope that's useful to you. But the outer world is moving from a bio-capitalism to a necro-capitalism, and the focus on death and the focus on disaster. I think disaster capitalism is already a word that has been around for some time, but we are now entering a period of necro-capitalism. And democracy has been transubstantiated into totalitarianism. That has already happened. We need to come to grips with these changes and be able to respond proactively to create the kinds of situations that are still possible to create, the levels of freedom that are still exist, the niches in which the higher consciousness can be developed and disseminated, and as much as possible a unified grid of those who are on the same wavelength to work together, even though separated by space, which is also an illusion, but connected in that unified field. And you may be very surprised how much power that the human spirit has when it is awakened fully and activated fully. But we must get past the ego's fear zone and what Agamben calls the zone of indistinction between the bios and the zoe, and the indistinction between law and lawlessness, because both of them have become the same. But to get to that place where karmic law and cosmic law and the divine law have the jurisdiction over what is happening, and that is very clear, so that one does not feel like one's a victim or one's in the hands of some nefarious power of some kind. All of that is part of the illusion, not part of the real. So we must be free of the fear that comes with the illusions of Maya. Okay. Does that make sense to people? Do most people understand this and recognize the urgency of transcending? So I want to talk a little bit more about now what we have lost. Okay? Can you erase that for me, please? Thank you. Before all of this began, pretty much the whole world was turned into a capitalist system, right? Globalization, etc. And capitalism has had a psychological effect on human beings. For one thing, it's a profane system, a secular system, and we have been indoctrinated for over 100 years in a belief in scientism, materialism, consumerism, and an ever more dumbed down educational system that has caused us to lose our curiosity for higher truth, and we have also seen the corruption of the religious institutions that have caused us to justify our cynicism and our turning away from the traditional values that were the cornerstone and the source of strength and meaningfulness in human culture.